You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from theheart.org on Medscape.
Hi, everyone. This is John Mandrola from theheart.org Medscape Cardiology, and this is This Week in Cardiology for February 8th, 2019. This week, statins in the elderly, heart transplants, Impella RP, exercise and coronary artery calcium, and heart disease and stroke statistics. The first topic is statins in the elderly. The cholesterol treatment trialists have published another meta-analysis of large statin trials to compare the effects of statin therapy at different ages. Lancet published the study. Now you might think, why do we need another statin meta-analysis? Well, there is not a lot of data on statin use for primary prevention in people older than 75. And the data that is there suggests really minimal benefits in this group. For instance, in the subgroup analysis of PROSPER trial, pravastatin benefited the elderly for secondary prevention, but not primary prevention. Similarly, in the HOPE-3 trial, statin had no benefit for those age greater than 70. So this meta-analysis included more than 186,000 patients that were included in 28 trials, and about 8% of the patients were older than age 75. The follow-up was about 5 years, and the authors observed a significant reduction in major adverse cardiac events, MACE, in all age groups, although the proportional reductions diminished with age. The main figure, figure 1, shows the forest plots, and while the risk reductions are mostly consistent across age groups favoring statins, the absolute risk reduction in event rates is about 0.5 to 0.6%, which is tiny. 0.5% absolute risk reduction means 995 out of 1,000 people who take a statin get the same result as those who do not. And for stroke, the risk reduction in the elderly was a mere 0.1%. Two editorialists do a great job summarizing this study and highlighting its limitations, and much of what I'll say following is taken from their editorial. They wrote that the statistically significant but small absolute risk reductions in MACE occurred in patients who are enrolled in trials. Why is this important? Because patients enrolled in trials are highly selected, they often have fewer comorbid conditions, they have less drug intolerance, and usually better adherence than patients out here in the real world. So the translation is that even in these ideal patients, statin use in the elderly for primary prevention was associated with tiny benefits. The second weakness of these sorts of studies is that trials included in this meta-analysis focus primarily on efficacy endpoints, and adverse events were not as fully recorded. Now that is understandable, but when considering use in the elderly, it is important also really to consider adverse events. My view of preventive therapies is that they are designed to make people elderly. Once a person is old, he or she has succeeded, and perhaps maybe even our preventive therapies have worked. So the elderly are on the house's money, and now, in our discussions with patients, we should focus much more on avoidance of harm and burdens of primary preventive interventions. Second topic, heart transplant. Numerous authors sent a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine recently showing an increase in the number of hearts recovered from young people who died from drug overdoses. It was a sharp rise, approximately threefold increase in drug overdose deaths in the past 2 decades, and it has had the effect of decreasing the length of the waiting list for a new heart. Back in 1999, the percentage of donor hearts coming from overdose deaths was 1.5%, and now it's up to 18%. The authors of the New England Journal of Medicine letter showed a color-coded map of the U.S., and that shows that the rise in donor hearts from overdose victims has great regional variation. New York and Pennsylvania had the sharpest rises. Journalist Deborah Beck has a great news summary of this, and one thing I learned from her piece was that about 1 in 5 donor hearts from overdose victims are hepatitis C positive. But this is hardly an impediment to transplantation. The Stanford group just published a study showing that patients who got hep C positive hearts did just as well as patients who got hep C negative hearts. This is likely due to the availability of effective antiviral drugs. Now, just a brief comment. Stacy and I routinely see young people in our obituary page here in Kentucky, and it's just tragic to see these beautiful young people in the obituaries. I guess we could say that more people with heart failure are getting transplanted hearts offers a tiny, tiny, tiny glimmer of upside of this massive public health crisis that is the opioid crisis. Third topic, Impella RP. In 2017, FDA approved the Impella RP device for temporary RV support in patients who develop acute right heart failure following left ventricular assist device implantation, MI, heart transplant, or open heart surgery. At the time, the primary investigator of the pre-market approval study, which was a single-arm study of 60 patients, of whom 73% survived to 30 days, said that, quote, the Impella RP was opened up a new era in cardiovascular medicine. This week, we learned that that new era in cardiovascular medicine might be a bit off in the future, as interim results of the post-market approval study of Impella RP, which were ominously sent out in a Dear Doctor letter, showed that only 4 of 23 patients had survived to 30 days. That's a death rate of 83%. Now, the specific causes of all these deaths and the stark difference between pre- and post-market data is likely to be due to poor patient selection. The first thing to say, before saying anything negative, is that these are interim results. But after that, 2 thoughts come to my mind. One is that this shows the problem of FDA approval and CMS's coverage of a device that has inadequate pre-market evaluation. While patients with RV failure have high death rates, the Impella RP is an expensive, invasive device. Instead of a 60-patient single-arm pre-market study, why not require a 60-patient RCT in which half the patients get the device and half the patients get standard care? Then we might know something important about this device. My second thought is that once a device gets on the market, once FDA and CMS let it out there, indication creep is going to happen. Most of the motive of this indication creep is good. It's beneficent motive. Doctors want to save their patients. But that this device is sexy, marketed heavily, and reimbursed at high levels does little to prevent indication creep. It's simply human nature. The fourth topic today concerns exercise and coronary artery calcium, an increasingly common thing that we're seeing in the office. The Cooper Clinic is a preventive medical practice in Texas that focuses on lifestyle modification for optimal health. It has mostly white, educated people with good access to health care who go there. Investigators from the Cooper Clinic have published numerous longitudinal studies concerning athletics and health. JAMA Cardiology published their latest study, which had 2 goals: to assess the association among high levels of physical activity with prevalent coronary artery calcium, and also to assess their future mortality risk. Now, the background here is that multiple smaller observational studies do report an association between heavy doses of running and coronary artery calcium. And of course, cases of runners with STEMIs do occur, and they stick in our mind. So this study had 21,000 men, mean age 51, included in the observational study. Women were excluded because too few women died. They just didn't have enough events to say much about events in women. The authors broke down the level of self-reported exercise into 3 categories: less than 1,500 METs per minute per week, between 1,500 and 3,000 METs per minute per week, and then greater than 3,000. Now, the higher exercise group equated to about 30 miles of running per week. The authors then dichotomized coronary artery calcium into 2 groups, less than 100 and greater than 100. The results were that men in the high exercise category were more likely to have coronary artery calciums greater than 100 when you compared it with low exercisers, and the hazard ratio there was only 1.11, with the lower limit being 1.03 to 1.20. In the group of high exercisers who had coronary artery calcium greater than 100, there was only 400 of 21,000 people. The average calcium score was 800. Now, looking at death rates at 10 years, men with high physical activity, big exercisers, and low coronary calcium were half as likely to die as men in the lowest category of physical activity. And men with the highest physical activity and coronary calcium greater than 100, they were not more statistically likely to die than those with the lowest physical activity level. Though the hazard ratio, the point estimate was 0.77, the confidence intervals went from 0.52 to 1.15. Now, the main weaknesses of this study, which the authors do a great job describing, were that first, it was self-reported physical activity. The focus of the paper is in the tail of the distribution. For example, the number of heavy exercisers were small, representing only 7% of the total population. And also, fortunately, there were not that many deaths, and thus this limits the statistical power to detect any difference in death rates. Now, I highlight this study because it is relevant. More and more people are doing marathons, and sadly, more and more doctors are doing coronary artery calcium scans. The good news is that the high exerciser groups tended to live longer, though it's hard to say the exercise dose is causal. For instance, this could simply be correlational, as those who can run 30 miles per week may just be genetically healthier people. Given the statistical limitations of this observational study, I think we just have to be careful making any conclusions about coronary calcium and the risk of death and exercise dose. Next topic today concerns the American Heart Association's recent stroke and heart disease report that they put out annually. It's published in Circulation. This is a 273-page document, so obviously I can only give you some highlights. Our headline on our news story said nearly half of U.S. adults have cardiovascular disease, mostly due to hypertension. And of course, this is not a surprise, since the 2017 hypertension guidelines redefine what is high blood pressure as greater than 130/80. Okay, sit down for this. As much as I would like to avoid saying it, health, especially public health, cannot be separated from politics. Blood pressure is a good example, but there are others. As medical leaders lower the bar to what it takes to have a disease, it gets to the point that just advancing in age, becoming older, makes it likely that you're going to get labeled as having a disease. This increases the power of the health industrial complex. And yes, I know I am part of that complex, but I really do, to buck the trend, and I try to leave people without complaints, mostly alone, and focus my efforts on people with clear diseases and complaints. Second comment on this report, chart 13-2 in the 273-page report chronicles death from heart disease since 1910. And this graph shows a gradual rise in heart disease deaths to a peak in 1950s, then a slight decline, and then a leveling off. And the death from heart disease rate is about the same today as it was in the 1960s in absolute terms. Now, that may sound shocking, but here are the reasons. First, everyone dies. People still die of heart disease at an older age. And yes, this is good, but we still spend oodles of dollars to care for older patients with heart disease. The other reason for the plateau is the rise in obesity and all of its risk factors. This is a strong force going against our progress in cardiovascular disease. The third reason for the plateau over the past 50 years is that much of the care we deliver in cardiology today is flat of the curve, low value care. Andrew Foy and I have written about this, and think about it. Pay attention to this the next time you do rounds or go to clinic. How much does the regular stuff we do in cardiology, the Paniagua, the nuclears, the echoes, the event recorders, really think about how much they contribute to reducing the burden of death from heart disease? Just consider as a thought experiment, if every nuclear camera in America stopped working tomorrow, how much would heart health be affected? Or consider the statin meta-analysis that I discussed earlier. The absolute risk reduction of non-fatal events in older people was just a mere 0.5%. Or consider the use of expensive devices like Impella devices in patients who are dying. I mean, how much do these things impact heart health? Not very much. So when you add up all the incremental stuff we do and then compare it to the millions of people living in poverty in rural areas or in big cities, or the millions of people sitting in their cars for hours each day commuting from suburbia, you can easily understand why deaths from heart disease have plateaued. Now look, I'm sorry, I don't mean to end on a down note. I love cardiology, I love electrophysiology, but it helps me to keep these big picture things in perspective. So that's it for this week in cardiology. I'm grateful that you listened. Again, remember, if you like this podcast, please consider subscribing, giving us a rating so other people can find us. Until next week, this is John Mandrola from the Heart.org Medscape Cardiology.
You're listening to This Week in Cardiology from the Heart.org on Medscape.